Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. I have a lot to cover, so I'm gonna try to do this within the time limit. I'll start with the boring part. I do have a few certificates and stuff that just basically say I know what I'm maybe talk about, but that's not the interesting part. I think the last point there might be the interesting part. I'm a developer in background. And as Björn mentioned, I've been looking into GDPR and how that will affect the way we write code and design systems. And that's what we're going to talk today about. But I'm going to start off a little bit so we get a baseline of what GDPR is. And in one sentence, this is what GDPR is. It is really common sense. For personal data. And I hope you will share that view after I'm done today. It is common sense in the way that we own our own data and we borrow it to people, to other companies, and they protect it and they give it back when we want it. So that's basically the common sense. GDPR comes from, it's an update of the current laws that was drafted and put into effect around 1995. The difference here is that it was a directive then. Directive is kind of a wish from the EU that all member countries draft their own laws, whereas this is a regulation. It basically means that it will turn into law that will cover all EU member states, which creates a uniform law, which is a lot easier to handle. So the same law in all European countries. It has a little bit broader definition of personal data. We'll look at that in a bit. It also regulates how we use personal data much more than before. And of course, everything, we all heard about this, it's the penalties. That's usually the way to scare people into thinking GDPR is a big scary thing. Of course, it's not going to work that way, but there are big penalties. We're not going to look at that today. It also expands the scope geographically. So where will GDPR apply? Well, first of all, if you're a company and have an office in the EU, GDPR will apply to that company. But if you offer your services, digital services, using an EU currency, that doesn't necessarily mean the euro, it could be Swedish crowns and so forth. A currency that exists within the EU, then GDPR applies as well. And it doesn't matter if you have an office in the EU. Same thing goes if you have an EU domain. Not necessarily .eu, it could be .se or any other domain name that exists within the EU. Or it could be a combination where it's like se.yourcompany.com. It clearly states that you're targeting a European market. And the final one is if you have it in a European language. So if you offer your service in a European language, it doesn't include English, because English is a national language. Same goes for Spanish and a few other. But if it's Swedish or Finnish or something like that, then it's clearly that you're targeting people within the EU. So that's a major difference. But then there's this number as well. This is another reason why GDPR is coming into effect and is so important. Does anyone know what this number could be? No, not really the fee, and it's not the balance of my account either, unfortunately. But it's a very big number. This is the number of leaked records since 2013. So it's about 1.5 per person on this planet. So quite many. And this is a big reason why we need something like GDPR. And another interesting fact with this number is that only 4% of this was leaked securely, meaning it was encrypted data. The rest was more or less in plain text. If you want to know if you've been part of a leak, you can go to this website. It's safe, I promise. So you can check out if you've been in any major breaches. So what's the value of this personal data we're supposed to protect then? For companies, apart from actually delivering a service to you, it could be that they're using it to track you, and of course then to deliver more targeted advertisements. And doing a lot of analytics, behavior analytics or any other kind. But there is also a dark side to this, as always. Personal data, most that have been leaked, will probably be traded somewhere, and that somewhere is usually the dark web. It could be used for fraud, identity theft, or blackmail. And these are quite serious things. In the beginning of the millennium, there was one of the biggest investigations ever conducted globally. They were investigating a child pornography ring, and it ended up that they arrested over 1,000 people. But it turned out that some of those people were actually completely innocent because they've been having their identity stolen. So this is quite serious things. So it's not just data that leaks away. They could actually be used for something quite terrible. And now the time is up. They're also used for blackmail in some instances. A couple of years ago, there was a service called Ashley Madison. I'm not gonna explain to you what it is. If you know what it is, that's good for you. Anyway, it's quite sensitive information, and it leaked the entire database. And there's one confirmed instance where this person committed suicide because of this leak. So leaked data is quite a serious thing. So we need to protect it, and that's what GDPR is about. And what is personal data then? Well, it's really any information that relates to you as an individual that can identify you. So it's quite a broad scope. It's a lot broader scope than previously if you look at personal identifiable information, which is what we used to work with before. And these are examples of what the GDPR thinks is personal data. So your name, your date of birth, your address, mobile device identifier, or even just digital identifier is personal data. So here we could potentially argue that IP addresses are personal data depending. Social data posts, this is a big game changer. And that's Facebook calling. Or anything important? No? Now all of a sudden, companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and so forth will not own your data. All the posts that you create will be yours, and that's the same thing with images. And then of course IoT collected data. So if you have something at home that sends up data generated from your home, that's your data. It's not the company that produced the device. So there are quite big changes in what personal data is. No, that's photographs that you upload. Hopefully you've taken them, otherwise you have other copyright issues maybe, but it's images that you upload to Twitter or to Instagram and equal services. There's a sensitive category in the GDPR, and if you deal with any of these categories of personal data, there are more things you need to put in place. I'm not going to go into details here, but these are considered sensitive data. And everything is really based on consent. We have to give consent to the company before they can do anything with our data. And this has to be in a way that we can understand. It cannot be these lengthy user agreements anymore. It cannot be something a lawyer would understand. It needs to be in clear, understandable text. And we cannot be forced into giving it. So in the same way that this box isn't ticked, we cannot have pre-ticked box anymore. It has to be something you actively do. And then there is another section where it deals with children, which is in the EU's definition, anyone below age of 16, where you the EU countries, this is one area where you can, for every country, do a little modification and lower that age, but it cannot be lower than 13. So if you deal with 16 as a baseline, that's you will cover everyone. But it wasn't really what GDPR is we're going to talk about today. But that was just to give you a very, very quick introduction and sort of a baseline what we're talking about. We're going to talk about a fictional company and how they have structured and changed their product into complying with GDPR on a technical level. And the fictional company is called Cloudpill. It's a company that offers you a service where you can, in a diary kind of sense, keep track of your medication. So how often you need to take pills or which pills and so forth. And of course, when you go to the website, you will end up on some sort of landing page welcoming you. And there's one thing that always happens in most websites when the first time you go there, or even the second time and so forth. Can anyone think of what that is? There is a cookie set. Exactly. And of course, this cookie here could be really considered to be a digital identifier because it's there to track you most often. It will identify you as a person the next time you visit it, or even over different web pages. We have a setting in the browser that's called Do Not Track. And this has been there for many years. It's just most sites today do not take that into consideration. The thing is that with GDPR, this was most likely be counting as not giving consent. So we have to start taking this into consideration. If someone has set this in a browser, we cannot track them because then we'll not comply with GDPR. This here has nothing to do, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Today, we have banners everywhere. It says, we're going to use cookies. If you continue using this site, we'll do this and that. That's not okay, GDPR. We need to ask first. We cannot set the cookie. We need to ask for permissions first. I'm getting that a little short bit. This here has nothing to do with GDPR. This is just common sense. So if you don't know what this is, talk to me afterwards. Yeah. It could be. It could be. IP addresses can be considered digital identifiers, and often for a period of time they are, and they might be reused for something else. So yes. There will be ways around this, and companies will probably find other ways of tracking people. But no, in a sense, you couldn't. Consent is the base of everything. There are different ways of getting consent. But yeah. Consent is the word of today. Before we set this cookie, we will have to ask. So in the same way you were touching on, we need to ask before we actually set that cookie. And a very important bit is that the default is that they don't give you consent. So if they don't say anything, we can't do anything. And that's the opposite of what we're doing today. And a very important thing, and GDPR is very specific on this, is that it should be equally easy to withdraw your consent as it was to give it. So we cannot hide this into some sort of obscure menu somewhere behind other things that are not related. Or we can't tell the user, please clean your cache or remove the cookies, because that isn't as easy as giving consent. We really need to have somewhere where you can just untick the box. So that's a big change. No, if you have gotten that far, and we'll touch a little bit on that later on, then you probably already have consent. So another very important thing is this here. This is usually what we do. We set cookies forever. Maybe not in this way, we might use something else. But we set them forever. And sure, this isn't forever, but in theory it is. So we cannot do this anymore. We need to be very specific. Everything needs to have a limit in life. So, and we need to inform the user that we're gonna just keep this information or set this cookie for this long. Then we need to make sure it's deleted. So we can't keep things forever anymore when it relates to personal data. Okay, of course, Cloudpill is interested in converting people into registered users. So no visitors anymore. So they have a registration page. And often that involves a web form that we need to fill in with your personal details. It could be for creating a new account. It could just be for signing up to a newsletter. The important part here is we only collect as much data as we need to provide that service. We cannot collect anything more than that. We can't collect things just because it's good to have, which is the way we've been doing it up until now. We rather do data maximization today, because maybe that's a good piece of data to have in the future. GDPR strictly tells us not to do that. Only as much as we need. It will apply for anything that's a digital service. So mobile apps as well, yes. And we need to tell them how long we intend to keep this data. So if it's for a newsletter, maybe we'll say, well, we'll keep it for as long as you signed up. And then when you stop wanting to receive our newsletter, we'll remove it after a certain period of time. The same goes for a new account. So the day when you delete your account, we'll remove your personal data. But it could also be a set date. We'll only keep it for 6 months, because that's how long we keep on sending you new stuff. And then after that, you have to sign up again if you want it. So we need to implement these kind of new ways of thinking, really. Word of today, consent. So the same way that we usually ask for a user agreement here somewhere, we need to ask for consent to handle this data that they will be giving us. And this consent, of course, needs to be informed. We need to clearly explain what we're going to use this data for. And we can't use that data for anything else. If it's just purely to create an account, then we'll say that. But then we can't go off and use that for marketing purposes, the email that they're giving us. Then we have to state that here as well. So everything that we intend to do with that data needs to be specified when they provide it to that service. If it's child consent, then we have to do anything that is reasonable to try to have the child's parent to give the consent. So some way of actually verifying that it's the parent that's giving the consent. There's no examples of how to do that. Probably it's going to be that fill in your date of birth and maybe verify an email and so forth. But GDPR isn't describing how to do these things technically. Just that we have to do it. We also need to prove that we have consent. So this is quite different. Previously, we just put a cookie on the user's computer, and that's it. We need to prove that we actually asked, and they gave it to us actively. And there could be many ways of doing that. We'll look at that in a second. For now, they click submit and they become a registered user. Again, if you don't know what the red box, what that means, we can talk later on, but that's also important. So what could proof of consent be? Very simple example, it could be a timestamp. So using this service, you have to go through this process and we timestamp it. Maybe enough, we don't know yet, but that's probably the minimum amount we need to store. Maybe we're storing IP addresses just to kind of prove that it was from this IP address when the consent happened. The important thing here is that we might have to say we're going to store your IP address as proof of consent when we ask for consent. This could also be a way. We get the fingerprint of a browser, and this is usually how many services track you nowadays and identify you, who you are. So this is quite a common way of actually very precisely identify a particular user in a sense, even if it's the browser. We can also use third-party identification service. In Sweden we have BankID, which could be potentially a good way of actually signing off the consent and keeping proof of it. But we need to do it. We need to be able to prove that we have gotten consent. And then of course we want to make money. So Cloudpill is interested in earning a few bucks. So they have a checkout page. The user brings out their credit card. Again, if you don't know what the red box is, I'll tell you about it afterwards. We use a third-party service perhaps to handle the transaction. And here's an interesting one, implied consent. So again, it's consent. This time it's implied. The thing is that GDPR wants us to ask for consent, but if it's implied, if you can understand why you're giving personal data to this service, we don't have to state it in text and ask for a lot of boxes to be ticked. Example, you buy something off an online site, and then all of a sudden, you don't know why, they ask for your address. You just bought like a TV, why do you want my address? Well, it's kind of implied, because they need to deliver it to you, so they need your address. So then you don't have to ask for consent. But if you do anything else with that piece of information, you have to ask for consent. So you can only use it for the obvious thing, delivering that thing that you bought online. If you use it to send marketing letters afterwards, that's not okay. You don't have consent to do that. And it can only live for so long. So however long Elgiganten needs your address, that's for how long they can keep it. After that, they need to delete it. This is also an interesting one. I don't know if you can read it, but it basically says that if you use any third-party services, you have to make sure that they are compliant to GDPR. And you might have to tell your user that you're going to send their data to a third-party service. If you use Klarna, that's a getaway, because then you hand over all the responsibilities. So any payment services that integrates with their own services into your website, that's a getaway, because then the responsibility is on them. But they still need to comply with GDPR. But of course, you could decide to store it in your database, maybe use the third-party service later on to do the transaction. So you store credit card number, physical address, and maybe a phone number in here. And all these are personal data. Yes, there are. I didn't go into all the details about GDPR, but there are two basic roles when it comes to companies. It's the processor, which is the first party, and it's the controller, which is the first party, and the processor, which is the third party. And there needs to be an agreement in between there for you to transfer personal data to another company. And that's basically what this star is about. So, yeah. Yes, you will have to ask for it here. If you use third-party service that integrates it within your, so it's actually their interface doing it, then you might not have to do anything. But if it's your interface doing it, you might need to do something. But if you decide to keep it here, because your third-party service doesn't support monthly subscriptions, so you need to keep on sending it every month, then you need to store it here. And then, of course, you need a process for doing that. And this might be a problem. You might need to ask for consent for doing this. So you need to make sure that your consent, the one that was either written when they signed up, or the one that you displayed here, and it wasn't implicit or implied, needs to cover what you're going to do with it, with their personal data. So you need to inform them what's going to happen, and again, they need to be able to withdraw their consent as easily as it was to put in their credit card number here and agree with the consent that you presented them with. Storing credit cards numbers. This is the credit card number. No one is writing it down. That's good. It's not a real one, although it's mathematically correct. It's actually a MasterCard. All MasterCards start with a 5. Or at least should. There are many ways of actually storing this. We could use something called masking. And that's basically just, we don't store this, we just store this here. We can't actually do anything with that credit card, but it might be a service for our users. So for example, this is the credit card that you signed up with. So they will know, okay, I'm using this credit card. We might store the credit cards in another way or in a third-party service somewhere, but this is just information for the user. Amazon does this quite a lot, so you can see which credit card they have on file. This other one here is what we call format preserving encryption. And this is actually encrypted, at least the red digits are. And it's encrypted with a strong encryption like AES 256 bits, but it looks like a credit card. And it's not actually any weaker than a normal encryption. The thing is that you just keep going until you get the result you want. And why would you want a similar format for a credit card, for example? If you use a third-party service, they might use another service, and you send a credit card along a long chain of services, and they all validate that it's a proper credit card number, not a real one, but just a proper. So you need to keep certain information, and you need to keep the format. So when this hits the bank, they can encrypt it, but no one else can until. Sorry? Did I? I meant decrypt it. Good, thank you. You have to talk to Björn here. So this part here, that's kind of defining what kind of a credit card it is and what bank and so forth, and this is just a sort of a check number that this is a valid format. So this is one way of actually storing data and keep the format in an encrypted way. This is hashing. This is not very good for storing credit card numbers. This is just to show an example. This is better if you're gonna store a password or something. Now this is an MD5, maybe not the most recommended hashing algorithm. It's just shorter, can fit within a slide. I have one more. Base 64. Just looking all the reactions. Good, thank you. This here, I hope no one is using. I mean, you might use it for other things. This is really good for actually transferring data. But securing it is kind of crap because it's more or less exactly the same as the plain text. It's just another way of writing the same thing. So don't use that, at least for storing credit cards. But Cloudpill, of course, they have a killer feature. So they have actually developed something that they call cloud connected pills. That's a way of using IoT to monitoring how many pills do you have left in that jar. So you don't have to do anything. It will do everything for you. So it sends up all this information to a database, and now they're dealing with health data. So that could be a warning sign. Health data is one of the sensitive categories that GDPR has identified personal data. And they will have a process here doing a few things on this data. Mainly because they want to be able to at some point send out new medications. So you don't have to go and buy them, they'll just arrive in your mailbox. The thing is that the GDPR says that you have the right to rectify data, correct data if you feel it's wrong. So if you feel that this system has told Cloudpill that you're taking 10 pills, where you're supposed to take 2, then you have the right to go in and change that data. It's your data, you have the right to change it. So we need to provide a service to allow our users to correct data, if it's their data. And in this particular case, it is. This doesn't have to be an interface that we develop. It could be a manual process. Some poor person somewhere might need to go into a database and do this manually, but this our users' right with the GDPR. They also have the right to object to processing this or any other way that we're using the data and say, well, I don't want you to do this anymore. You can keep my data, but I do not want you to process it. And that goes into limiting processing as well. And a better example of this is that if you think about the credit rating company, they will get all this information about your salary and your payment history and so forth, and they will tell a potential bank that your credit rating is this good or this bad or whatever. But maybe you don't agree with that automatic process. Maybe you feel that they don't see the whole picture. Then you have the right to object to that decision if it's done by a computer automatically. Yeah. Yeah, so if I wasn't happy with this result, then I can call to that company or contact them in some way and say, well, I'm not happy with that. So, for example, you need to stop processing my data because you don't know the whole picture. I want you to change the data because it's not correct. So we need ways, I'm going to show a little bit example of that in a bit. We need ways of actually telling which user we should process or not. And of course, thinking about credit rating, it's not meant for you to change your history, but maybe you feel that there's not enough of correct data in the system for them to be able to take the right decision automatically. So we need to, if this happens, we also need to be able to pull out all the information from the database so a human person can take the decision, because that's the right. You can have a human person taking the decision instead. They might come to the same conclusion, but it's your right. So we need to provide that person with the same setup of data as our automatic process used to take the decision in the first place. So maybe a few SQL queries needs to be written there. We send this off to a third party, Cloudpill does at least, which then sends a package home to the user to deliver that data. And hopefully, by that time, the user becomes really happy. Yeah. In most instances, yes, it's the data that you give to a service. But then it's really their data. Because if you go back to what personal data is, it's information that can identify you as a person. So if you're giving away your neighbor's data, then it's still your neighbor's data. Yeah, there's a different. Politicians, in a sense, is a public person. In that role, you get lesser rights with your data. I mean, they still have a few personal data, but your role also have public information, and as a politician, you're a very public person. There's a slight difference there. But if this service collected data from a third party, and that happens quite a lot, you enter your social security number, and all of a sudden your personal physical address appears. But it's still your data, but it came from another system. So it doesn't matter if you give it away, as long as it's your data, it's your data. So thinking about limiting process, this is a really crappy example, but it's very simple. So if we would have a flag on the user saying that we should limit process, we need to skip processing. Otherwise, we could process it. So we might need to implement something like this, so we don't have to manually sit and edit things later on. If we were talking SQL, this would be a very silly example, but we only select users that doesn't have this flag set. And one other thing with this killer feature that Cloudpills has developed. What was the word of today? Exactly. The thing is that they didn't go publicly with this when the users signed up. So they didn't have this in their consent. So what they need to do is ask for consent again, if for those users who want to use it. So we end up in a situation where we might have consent versioning. We need to manage consents, yeah. A new feature is an opt-out, if that's what you meant. Yeah. Yes, if it's processing personal data. If it isn't processing personal data, then you don't need consent. So only when it comes to personal data. The thing is that you can't ask for something called a blanket consent, where it basically says, well, we'll do whatever we deem necessary for providing you with this service with your personal data. We need to be very specific. We use your data for this purpose. So they need to go out and ask again, which means that they might end up with a few users that has the new consent, a few users that has the old consent, and so forth. And of course, you can take the decision that we'll just halt everything until the user has agreed with the new consent, but that might not be possible. So we're gonna end up in a situation where we might have a table like this, simplified again. We have a few user IDs here, and we have versions of consent. Maybe we have a flag saying if they have agreed or not, and then some sort of proof, in this case just a simple timestamp. And then we can provide different services depending on which consent they have given. That really depends on the service, but I think we can all agree that just purely stopping a service is quite bad. And then we ask, then the user logs in 6 months later saying, why has nothing happened? Well, you didn't sign the consent. They're not going to be very happy. Yeah. Not the new consent. They still have given you an old consent for doing something else, but not for the new feature. Perhaps that really depends on your product, but just stopping it might be a bad idea, because just think about it. If you were, let's say you used Facebook, and all of a sudden Facebook brought up a new consent, and you were away from Facebook for 3 months, and you come back and nothing has happened. It was just as you left it. You're gonna start wondering why? surely something has happened in the world. And you might not be so happy because you didn't get all the updates that you wanted to have. So it might not be practical to just skip all processing just because you have a new feature, which is why you might end up in some sort of consent versioning. And of course, data maximization, I mentioned that before. We could be tempted to collect many things. PowerPoint doesn't have so many symbols. I just used what they had. But explicitly, GDPR tells us to minimize the data we collect. Only for the purpose that we're going to use it for, and just as much as we need. So we can't go off and start, for our little IoT device here, start collecting temperature or something like that if we haven't asked for consent for doing that. But of course, we are now collecting sensitive data, thinking about the health data. And we need to protect that. And that's what GDPR is for, is to tell companies that they need to handle personal data carefully. Ways of doing that? Well, we could split it up into two databases, or however you would like to do it. Where one database, we put user data. Another database, we put this pills data that is generated by the IoT. We could do this in different ways. We could aggregate it. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And we need still some way of connecting this together. So we create a random token. Nothing that connects to anything. Just some random series of digits and numbers, same thing, or letters. And then we have a way of indexing these together. The important thing here is random. It cannot be tied to anything that's identifiable. Yeah. Well, it comes from your home. And it's generated by an IoT device that you control. So it is really your data. I mean, personal data is not necessarily things that we consider personal identifiable information, which is basically something that points directly to us, like our name. But it could be things around us that could be used to identify us. And then it might be okay. I might come to that later on. I'll see if I answer your line of thoughts there in a while. The thing is, if we do this separation, and we do this correctly, maybe using aggregation or something else, but at least uses a random token, we can actually provide a third-party service with this information, because now this is not identifiable, unless you have that database. So this could be research or statistics or whatever. There's no identifiable information in this database. It's fairly safe to give away depending on how we stored it. So in a very simple example, this is how we would do it. We would have a user table in one database. We will have a random token, which will connect another table in another database where we store the medicational history of how many pills and so forth that this person has taken. Looking at aggregation, this is an example of aggregation. We put things together so you can't really identify who did what. But there's an interesting fact about that. This little piece of JSON here is kind of a statistics. There's a group, and then probably there will be more data here. If we look at, this is the selection. If we now imagine that this data was actually correct data which would put me in that group, then in my particular situation, that would point to 32 people, which is a fairly large group of people. But then, if we decided to, rather than looking at an age group, we will say, well, we want to know for people born this year. Now, this is a wish from my side. I'm not born that year. But anyway, that would actually, if it was my year, point at 5 people. So we're getting dangerously close to actually identifying people. But we could actually put in information if this person is married or not. That could be an interesting, depending on what kind of study we're doing. In my instance, if this would be correct data, that would now point at 2 people. And then, of course, I just really need to round this off. So if I put in with month they would be born, then of course it would point to 1 person. This is a very long-winded example, but it just serves to prove that we need to be careful when we aggregate data, because they could be used to identify people if done incorrectly. Yes, if we have our user, I mentioned before that companies borrow people's data. So we need to give them access. So anything that we collect in our little database, we should be able to send back in machine-readable format. We need to track the data. So if we store people's data, we also need to know where did we store them and whose data is this? Because they could come back and request that data. And machine-readable data, I'm thinking JSON, XML, and so forth. If you're interested in how that could look like, go into your Google account and find My Data section, and you can actually download everything Google knows about you, hopefully. This could be a manual automatic process. That really depends on the size of the system and how common this would be. Someone could do this manually. We have roughly 30 days, according to GDPR, to actually comply to this kind of thing. You can extend that period if you have good reasons to do so. One thing we need to be really careful about is other people's data. We cannot leak other people's data here, so we need to track data. We need to know who's who. There is derived data, which isn't included here. So think Spotify. Spotify knows a lot about your music taste. And you actually own, after GDPR, all statistics of what you've been listening to. So all songs that you listen to and all your playlists, that's yours. But Spotify have another feature where they recommend things that they sort of derive it from what kind of music you usually listen to. That's their data. That's derived data from your personal data. It's not your data, because they did some calculations for that. But the songs that you've been listening to, that statistics, that's your data. There's another interesting suggestion from GDPR, and it says if it's technical possible, then we should provide a way of actually sending people's data to another similar service. And looking at it straight like that, it might feel like a strange thing, because why are we providing our competitors, in this case is PillCloud, those bastards. But if we're using open standards, maybe this could happen. And why would this be a good thing for CloudPill? Well, because as much as our users in CloudPill want to try this new service, maybe they want to try our service. So it's a two-way win-win, or how to put it. Yeah. All user data. So in the same way we're sending back here, which will be data from multiple databases, if we decide to segment it like that. Yes, but we still have a random token that we use to identify, so we can provide a service and provide statistics and diagrams or whatever to the user. But as soon as we remove that token, or we don't have the rest of the other database in order to identify them, it is kind of separated from that. If you have both of them, you can actually use them to identify. Yeah. Yeah, the thing is that GDPR replaces laws today. It's retroactive in many instances. There are a few instances where it won't apply, but it will cover all data collected previously. So what's going to happen on the 25th of May next year, we're not really sure. Will our inboxes be filled of companies asking for consent that we already signed up to? Not sure. But it is a very difficult problem because it will cover all the data we already collected. It's not illegal. GDPR doesn't outlaw collecting data. It just tells us when it's okay and how we're going to use it and what we need to do in order to collect it. We can have personal data. It doesn't outlaw it. We just need to be careful. We need to think about it like if you borrow something from your best friend, he's going to want that thing back. And you have to give it back in the same state that you borrowed it. Otherwise, he's going to be mad at you. That's the kind of relationship that the EU is building now between companies and users. Yes, I mean, I'll get to that in the end if we have time. But yes, it's a valid point. Yeah. There is one that's talked quite a lot about, and that's it's usually called the right to be forgotten. Technically, it's called the right for erasure. It's the same thing. You have the right to delete your account. You can tell a company, I don't want to be part of your service anymore. Remove all my personal data. That's fine in theory, but the technical part isn't maybe that easy. But we did one good thing. We just split it into two databases, if you remember. This is the first database. This is user data in here. So we don't have to delete anything from the other database. Because if we remove the connection, the random token, we have no way of pairing those together again. But we have another problem. We do backups, of course. If we don't, we should probably start doing it. But it also creates a problem considering GDPR. Because if someone wants to be deleted, we need to delete them there as well. And that's a bit of a problem. So how do we go about doing that? Well, one way is to create another database or something similar where we store encryption keys. One key per user. And then we use that key to encrypt each and every user in this database with their own key. And then when they decide that they don't want to be part of this system anymore, we remove the encryption key, rendering this data in here and the data in here completely useless. You mean that? Like a good TV chef. Well, this one, we maybe don't need to back up that as often, because GDPR tells us we have 30 days to comply. So if we have a fairly more aggressive turnaround on backups on this one, where it naturally dies 30 days later, it will disappear from the system. Yes, I'll get to that in a minute. Maybe not the way you want it to be, but I'll get to that. And if someone wants to be deleted, we actually need to inform any third-party service that we have provided them with personal data for that user. So if we use something else where we send off personal data, we need to tell them to delete it as well. It's not our responsibility to make sure they do it, but we need to inform them. Yeah, that could potentially happen. I don't have anything straight up, but it's a good problem. So I'll think about that a bit. Yeah. In a sense, you do get a new clean sheet the next time you come to that service. But there are many problems with how do you know if someone told you not to receive any marketing emails? You still need to store something. There are things that GDPR doesn't actually give good answers to. And I think there's a few things that we need to see how it will turn out. But it's a good question. When we delete people, we shouldn't forget about binary files. That could be images that someone uploaded or something like that. They are their data, so we need to remove them. This one is an interesting one. This is usually technically difficult to delete people from cached files if we're talking about web services and stuff. Hopefully, they will die over time. So it could be proxy servers and whatever. GDPR doesn't actually tell us that we need to do anything or how we should do this technically. So that could be a problem. But if we control those servers, maybe we just put down the caching time to enough so things will be deleted. We have to make sure they're deleted though. Log files. We never delete log files, so that's not what I'm saying. Just don't store personal data in them, because then you have a problem. Yes, again, it's a very difficult problem because we probably need to store IP addresses. But in a sense, you could argue that IP addresses are digital identifier, meaning it's personal data. There's no clear solution of how that will turn out, but my recommendation is keep logging as you would do normally, but don't store personal data in it. Maybe coming a little bit to your question there. There are other people using your system apart from your users, and those are admin people. They usually have their own little portal. Maybe they might go straight to that database as well. That depends on the system. The thing is that GDPR tells us that we need to limit access to data, personal data. So only people that need that data should have access to it. So if you're an administrator over a system, but you don't actually need to see personal data, you shouldn't see it. I know it's not the answer you were looking for, but that's what GDPR tells us. And if we use encryption then we are actually making sure they can't see it in an easy way, because they could just as well get that encryption key and decrypt the data, but we're making it more difficult. It's not that easy to see that data. We also need to do logging. So we need to log who did what, who looked at what, or so we can actually track it back in case if something happens. And we should stop sharing admin accounts. I know this is a shocker. We need to have individual accounts to everything, because we need to make sure that data is limited only to the people that needs to see it, and we need to know who did it. Therefore, we need to have individual accounts. Yes? We might just log which admin person logged in, like a normal log. This account logged in can be user ID or something like that. There is a difference between data you create as a professional person in your line of work and the data you create as a personal, as a private individual. So there's a distinction there. But we have, if we're looking at things that we develop, we have another side as well. And it could say developers here as well. But that's the people that develop the system. And testers tend to have the most need for this. They want a database to test against. And they want it as close to production as possible. And what's the common solution for that? Yeah, or you just create the snapshot of that and you put it there and just go off with it. And maybe a developer needed it to do some debugging, and he was working the weekend, but we did it from home, so he put it on the laptop and went home with it. That is not okay with GDPR anymore. If we're doing that, we need to make sure that that data is anonymized. So we need to have a process that actually converts this identifiable data into something you can't identify anymore. Because we are responsible for the protection of that data, and usually a person's laptop or another environment than production is less secure. So this is a very important bit. That is close to everything I had. There's a little takeaway here. Get consent, don't do anything else than what that consent has given you. Treat all your data as borrowed. You need to track it, and of course you need to allow to edit in one way or another. And make sure it dies at some point. Don't collect more than you need. Segregate it, use encryption or tokenization or something like that. Use open standards because it's going to make your life easier. Limit access to personal data. So even if the admin of the system wants access to personal data, maybe he doesn't need it. Don't give it to him. And of course, don't make copies of production data or databases. This is more or less everything I had, but since they're unpacking, I'll do the little stretch thing. There is a get out clause from GDPR. Don't tell anyone. It's not as easy as you think, because it's called anonymization. If we can collect data that we can guarantee doesn't point to an individual, we don't have to comply with GDPR. But this isn't as easy as you're thinking. In 2009 or something like that, you might have heard the company, it's called Netflix. They used to have a competition, a yearly competition, where they provided a data set of these four things. It was a user ID, an integer, a movie ID, an integer, a date of grade, which was a date stamp, and a grade on a movie, which also was an integer. And they provided half the set with this information, date of grade and grade, and the other with just the two above. And then the competition was to find an algorithm that could predict what a certain user with an ID would give a movie grade on the set that you didn't have that information. Sounds like nerdy fun. The problem was, and this is always the problem, there was a few university students. They're always university students, hate them. They actually found a way of taking this data and then taking data from the Internet Movie Database and were able to identify a quite large percentage of these users from the grade that they gave here and the grade they've done on Internet Movie Database. So this is anonymized data, but it's a lot more difficult than you think. So even if anonymization is a get-out clause, you should use it carefully. So I'm not going to start over and do it again. I was just looking for this slide here. Oops. Thank you. So this is everything I had. If you had friends who wanted to see this in live, we will run it again, not in this forum, end of next month, next year. Information can be found on our website. Also provide a workshop if you want to work with your product into how to comply with GDPR. And I have a question for you before I end. Would you be interested in either a talk or some other kind of information about design patterns, particular designed for GDPR compliance technically? So it sounds like a good thing to talk about or describe, and go quite down to how to actually design systems with patterns. Good? Then we'll see if that happens. So for now, I thank you for listening. Thanks.